In the Trump administration's bid to completely remodel the US state and its relationship to the outside world, few actions had the potential to be as immediately impactful as the decision to shutter the principal American foreign aid agency, USAID. Certainly within the United States, the decision had massive shockwaves. As well as provoking a debate about what role soft power could and should play in how America acts abroad, it also sparked a minor constitutional crisis, with the Supreme Court intervening to say that Trump and his government were not acting within their power to cut billions of dollars of funds that had been approved by Congress. But as is so often the case when Donald Trump is involved, the Washington-focused debate risked obscuring the real-world impact of what these cuts would mean for the millions of people impacted by US foreign aid around the world. As ever, on the last Friday of every month, the lead hosts Global Insights, the current affairs show hosted by my colleague Kwangu Liwewe, our Africa editor. On this episode of Global Insights, Kwangu, who joins me now, chose to draw attention to the African continent, because every single state in Africa, with the exception of Eritrea, received some form of aid from the US in 2023. So, Kwangu, welcome. It's understandable why you chose to focus on the continent that you know so well. But I imagine it's still a challenge to work out exactly what the impact of the cuts will be on such a vast and complex continent.
Yes, hi Faisal. So our colleague, Erin Brown, who is a North Africa editor, actually brought this up. She was my first guest on the podcast. So American aid is integrated into the economies of all these countries in different ways, and really to varying extents. I mean, from development projects to government budgets. So the impact to these cuts is still unfolding. I mean, it's only been a few weeks, but we're already seeing concern from officials, we're seeing concerns from organizations, and even the local staff who worked at these agencies.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine that it's a period of immense fear and frustration, because as you say, it's so integrated into the economies that if it were removed, a significant portion of the income might go away.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And as I said, I mean, a lot of people are talking about the Americans who worked at USAID, and not much notice or talk has been given to the local staff who've been working in these agencies as well. And of course, the recipients who are the everyday Africans who are already feeling the impact of this.
I think one of the issues that I've had with the reporting around the story is that it's tended to be dominated by the thinking that obscures some of the painful details. There was an opinion piece in one of the foreign policy magazines that argued that the end of US aid is an opportunity for Africa. And that, to my mind, that doesn't really consider the more immediate and devastating consequences of it.
So yes, Erin really articulated those details, and she did make a point to highlight the different sides of aid delivery. I mean, she was clear that cuts to life-saving healthcare would have serious consequences. For instance, if we look at the HIV and AIDS pandemic on the continent, I mean, these antiretroviral drugs that are needed are very crucial to people who are HIV positive. So adherence is a key issue. Once this is withdrawn, there's a lot of worry about that. Now, my second guest, James Shikwati, he's a Kenyan economist. He took a more critical view of the aid system, so he sees this more in a positive light. He even calls it a wake-up call, rather, than a golden opportunity or anything like that.
Well, it sounds like it's a very interesting discussion. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Kwangu.
Thank you, Faisal. Here's this week's episode of Global Insights on the Lead. Erin, thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Of course, I'm glad to be here.
So now you've spent years reporting on North Africa. I mean, you've covered everything from political upheavals to economic challenges. And I imagine you've seen how foreign aid plays a role, not just in policy decisions, but even in people's daily lives. Now, with USAID pulling back, how are African governments reacting to this?
You know, I think there's a real variety of responses across the continent. Africa is obviously not a monolith, and different places are feeling it in different ways. You have some governments that have entire sectors that depend on U.S. aid, especially in like healthcare or education, that are really reeling, trying to figure out how they're going to fill the gap. And in other places, you know, USAID has funded smaller development projects or is really working on smaller projects or working on democratic norms or judiciary work, that kind of stuff that we may not think of when we're thinking about USAID, but that is in many ways just as crucial.
Okay. So what are the immediate effects of the cuts on the people on the ground?
Yeah, so it's super interesting because I think one of the first things that we heard about USAID being cut was the kind of the two really big ones, which was food aid, necessary food aid in places where there's famine, where there's conflict. So that's whether it's Sudan or Ethiopia. I mean, I believe Ethiopia is the largest recipient of USAID on the African continent. And those kinds of immediate needs getting put in the proverbial wood chipper were really astounding because it's the kind of thing where one day to the next you have people who actually need that aid to survive. But simultaneously, you've got the big healthcare push. And I know, that's in East Africa, in parts of Western Africa, trying to keep the HIV/AIDS epidemic under control and under check is really, it is, again, it's a daily thing. You have to take your antiretrovirals every day in order to stay untraceable and untransmissible. And so I think the initial impact was on that emergency food aid and the health sector, but then there's all sorts of other fallout. And it's not just about these programs, but it's about all the people who make them run. One of the major criticisms of the aid industry is that it's quite a bloated, it's a bloated system. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of fat that can be cut. But when we get down to brass tacks, that fat to be cut is people's jobs. Some of those are rich Westerners. I live in Tunis, where we are a hub for what I affectionately call the bingos, the big international NGOs. And lots of aid workers here, they live in a really kind of luxurious lifestyle because the cost of living is so low. And right now we're seeing just an emptying of the kind of expat communities because so many people were working on aid projects. And there's something to be said about thousands of Americans losing their jobs, and not just their jobs, but their entire sector, right? It's not just like, okay, your job has been made redundant and maybe now you can go to a different company and find something. If you are like a specialized aid worker, you now no longer have an industry to work in. But more importantly, I think, and something that we haven't talked about as much is the impact on local staff. There
Absolutely.
are so many extremely talented, very dedicated people from the host countries who are working at these organizations, not just because it's a job to have, but because a lot of them are really motivated to make their own country a better place. And these are people who have the kinds of skills and talents that could very easily be taken abroad, right? In Tunis, for example, if somebody speaks both French and English, which is at this point sort of a prerequisite for working with USAID, they could just as easily be employed in the private sector in France, not necessarily finding a solid job here in Tunis. But now these people are really adrift and are starting to look elsewhere. And that contributes to both brain drain and a lack of opportunities in the country, which I know one of the things that you want to talk about today is like whether or not Africa can fill the void left by USAID. So just by throwing these tens of thousands of local staff into unemployment, you're already contributing to a diminished return on that, because those are the kind of people who are easily going to be like, well, if I have to find a job and I want to find something that can continue to sustain myself, my family at the same level, I'm going to start looking in Europe or in the Americas or, wherever else.
Okay, and just picking up on that point about the local aid workers. And then if you look at the local communities as well, they are the aid recipients. I know Africa is a vast continent, but are you picking up how some of these countries are reacting to these challenges? And are they finding solutions, or is the situation just getting worse?
Well, I think it's too soon to tell, right? This is less than 2 months old, and governments are big ships to turn. I think right now governments are really starting to think about what gaps they can fill on their own, and then also who else they can reach out to fill those gaps. One of the biggest problems with the U.S. pulling out is that it leaves open just like a gaping hole, and there are two major players that want to fill that, and that's China and Russia. And you can look at a really great example, not necessarily about USAID being withdrawn, but just the French influence in the Sahel, which is a region that I cover. As France has withdrawn from the Sahel, there's not just, a wealth of resources from Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger that are just suddenly appearing out of nowhere to fill that void. What's filling that void is Russia. And both Russia and China are coming in arguably with very different approaches. China is really big on soft power with their Belt and Road Initiative. They are here to build you a beautiful hydroelectric dam or a high-speed railway, or, they're really into infrastructure. Russia is more leaning into supplying military, paramilitary groups, weapons, but also doing some of the soft power things as well. And so right now, I think most governments are just truly looking for where the bottom line is. And right now, that's Russia and China.
So now that the U.S. has pulled out its aid through USAID, clearly there are some calls for African countries just to become more independent now because of this move. And you've just eloquently told us about some countries depending on new foreign partners. Doesn't this kill the whole purpose of Africa standing on its own 2 feet and solving its own problems?
Well, yeah, but I don't think, if we're honest, Kwangu, I don't think anybody in the past, 50, 60 years, really since decolonization, has ever actually thought that what the objective was for Africa to stand on its own 2 feet. If we're being honest, and not that that's not an incredibly worthy goal, but the stuff that was coming in the last 50 years, it's kind of based on the Marshall Plan, reconstructing Europe. It didn't make sense for a continent that was set up for extractive resource management, right? That to get the resources out of Africa and to Europe, and the way that the aid, just aid writ large is structured is not designed for Africa to stand on its own 2 feet, and so I think it's hard to say that looking for different partners is defeating the goal. That's a super worthy goal in and of itself, but it's going to take a lot of painful changes that I'm not sure there's many countries on the continent that are in a position where they can make the kinds of changes, whether that's, honestly, just down to infrastructure or to skills or to, hard currency, to be able to flip this system that has been entrenched for the last half century on its head. I'm sure you are familiar with the writing of your fellow countrywoman. It's Dambisa Moyo, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dead Aid.
She wrote that really interesting book called Dead Aid that I think kind of outlines some of the key critical components of why the aid industry, just like the aid industrial complex, does not work, especially when we're thinking about, just infusions of cash into governments, right? The idea that donors don't know how to control the aid mechanisms when failure ensues, right? There's debt crises are mostly just a sign that earlier rounds of debt forgiveness aren't touching the fundamental problem, right? Motivating aid through guilt and glamour is really incompatible with fostering rigorous accountability for results. And also just selling Africa as this kind of helpless, needy place just does not, it does not help Africa, as you said, stand on its own 2 feet. I think the problem with an argument like that in debt aid is that this kind of modern monetary theory, and I think the guests that we're going to have join us later will be speaking to that. It sounds really great in theory, but when you have to get to it in practice, you're dealing with such entrenched systems, even just on the local level, that it's really hard to get there in practice. And this idea of things like foreign direct investment are really interesting, but the route to getting there it's a really long road. And, some people have been really excited about this cut of USAID, but people on the African continent who are thinking about this. But I think that the problem is that you've got you're going to have the collapse of some major systems, and it might not be the sort of gentle off-ramping that would need to happen in order to kind of get governments back on their own 2 feet. Is aid designed to make Africa less poor, or is aid designed to maintain status quo? One of the things that I see in Tunisia, where I live, is that USAID, in effect, like also really helped our president sort of slide the country straight back into autocracy, because it helped prop up some of the systems that he used to kind of assuage the masses, right? It helped pay for food subsidies and these kinds of things. I think that, aid, while it has altruistic roots, but I don't think the purpose of aid was ever to like get somebody up on their own 2 feet. I think it was to build soft power, to protect U.S. interests. Like we can say that the U.S.'s health programs in Africa that are designed to, stem HIV and AIDS are altruistic, right? It's saving millions of lives. It's keeping people healthy. People are living longer. But also that is keeping AIDS off of our shores. It's keeping other diseases at bay, like Ebola, honestly, malaria. The kind of work that we're doing around malaria vaccinations and all of that stuff. You're not seeing malaria in the United States right now, but as global warming comes up, we're starting to see more and more tropical diseases reaching the southern border because the climate is changing. And so if we think about cutting aid to something like the malaria projects and programs, that's a direct detriment also to people in the United States. So again, I think this idea that somehow aid was meant to help Africa pull itself up by its bootstraps is just the wrong framing for it. It's a mechanism of soft power. It's a mechanism of financial control and dependency, and it enables a continuation of the resource extraction that was a huge part of the initial, Western foray into Africa.
And then we've heard a lot of talk as well as some governments are framing this as a win for African sovereignty. Now, when we look at the continent as a whole, are we seeing this as a genuine Pan-African unity in response to this crisis? Or are African leaders just using this rhetoric to distract from their own failures?
Oh, I think it's the same kind of nationalism that you're seeing in Europe and in North America right now, right? It's the same brand of nationalism that's, bringing Trump to his dominance, as we're seeing just all across Europe. I think it's more bluster than anything. I don't think that you're going to see some really incredible Pan-African movement that will have the economic ability to build a new economic bloc that will actually make up for the several $100 billion worth of aid that's being lost. Since 1960, I think the total aid to African countries has been something north of $2.6 trillion. I think it's really hard to imagine a bloc being created that can have the economic wherewithal to do this. And that's not just because, first of all, Africa has so many different nations with different priorities, and there's obviously tensions. We've got a conflict, like active conflicts in several places on the African continent, but also because I think at the end of the day, you have a lot of governments that are very realistic, and they see that there are other partners who are willing to come in and finance things. And if they don't have to go through the painful transitions, economic reforms or cutting public debt, like all these sorts of things that are truly painful for a country to go through and that are terrible for a leader's reelection prospects, then of course they're going to turn to the UAE, they're going to turn to China, they're going to turn to Russia. They're going to say, "Dobar pожаловать," like, come on in, right? Uh-huh. Rather than taking the political hit and having their people go through the economic and social hits that come with actual reform.
Just picking up on that point about getting support from Russia and China and the Gulf nations, clearly this is just swapping one form of dependency for another, isn't it?
Oh, of course. And I think there are obviously thinkers and economists and people in government on the African continent who are really hoping for there to be a kind of African renaissance of technology, of, prosperity, et cetera, and the kind of ambition that comes with it. I was reading an article recently in Semaphore from a former Liberian works minister, and he made the argument that this was actually a really good thing to lose the aid. And he had recently been on a trip to China where he saw, all of this industrial development and all of this just really great public infrastructure. And he said in the article, he said, there's no future for an Africa that opts out or that opts to outsource its ambition, which is sounds so good. But then when you look at who they're using as an example of prosperity and realize that he's gone to China and seen how they've developed, I think a thing that was unspoken there is that that's done on the backs of human rights violations. It's not China is an incredible, whoa, what an incredible economic story. But that is done with an iron-fisted government and heaps of human rights violations. And the question is, do you want your people to go through that in order to have the economic success that you see in China? And also, are we in an era where that is even feasible?
Okay, now let's quickly look at the role of the civil society in all of this. I mean, NGOs throughout the continent have relied on foreign funding for many, many, many years. Now, with this withdrawn, can they actually survive it? And one of the criticisms about the NGOs is that most of them have Western interests. So does this really expose them as an extension of Western interests?
Well, I don't know if it exposes them as an extension of Western interests. I think that was already understood, that a lot of these NGOs, when they are working on things that are purportedly Western values, we can swap the word interest in there, right? Even things that we find genuinely altruistic. The truth is, if you're working for a pro-democracy organization, that means that you probably want democracy to succeed, in theory, right? But no, most of these NGOs are, dozens of NGOs here in Tunis have closed up. And I don't think they can survive this, especially, if you've got 3/4 of your contracts are fulfilling USAID contracts. You just can't survive that. And so I think you're going to see a real shuttering of a lot of the kinds of organizations that, while yes, are promoting Western interests, are also in a lot of ways doing good work. These are working on pro-democracy stuff, working on, I think about a couple of small NGOs here in Tunis that do really important work on accountability in prisons, and it is very thankless work, but they make life better for people who are incarcerated. And those are some of the most vulnerable people that we have. Yeah, maybe this exposes some kind of, Western influence campaign. But the question then is, how did we not know that this existed before? And of course we did. Of course we did.
And then if moving forward, Africa turns to Russia and China, what does that say about their soft power and how it influenced the work being done on the ground by the NGOs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're going to see a shift in values, right? A country that I've been thinking about and worrying about a lot is Senegal, which has really, fought tooth and nail over the last couple of years to hold on to its democracy and to hold on to free and fair elections. And it is right on the edge of this, right? Russia is all over the Sahel, and it's hoping for more and more influence, and you're going to see an increase in a lack of democratic principles. And we can argue that what some people want is a strong autocrat that can keep the trains running on time. And there are plenty of people who do. But there's also real power in the kind of freedom that comes through democracy. And I think you're going to see less of that on the African continent in the coming years, because you are going to have more aid coming from Russia and China. I think they're going to continue to flood entire sectors. And let me tell you, autocrats love nothing more than NGOs that prop up entire sectors, because because then they can be completely removed from it, right? Like they don't have to worry about like healthcare if if the US is propping it up, or also like they don't have to worry about infrastructure if China's got it. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen, but I do think that we're going to have a market shift away from that real dedication to democratic principles and a shift towards autocracy.
Goodness, but clearly all that you have said is that external support, be it from Russia or China, wherever it's coming from, will continue to shape the continent's future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, I am American, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I'm not like a rah-rah America first kind of person. I do think that there are some really positive benefits to what is happening with the kind of development that you're seeing, particularly from China, because it is, they're coming in and doing infrastructure projects, and that's leading to foreign direct investment from the Chinese. But I do think that at some point that comes with a cost. And like we said earlier, China may be a really interesting model for economic growth and development, but what are you sacrificing in order to have that development? And are you willing to sacrifice the human rights of your population, of your people, to get there?
Erin, thank you so much for your insights.
Of course, take care.
That was my colleague Erin Brown in Tunis. While Erin highlighted some of those very tangible impacts that these cuts are going to have, I also wanted to hear the perspective of someone who is looking at the silver lining to the cuts to American aid. So I asked James Shikwati, an economist and writer, who's been very critical of traditional models of aid, onto the podcast. James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity to be on your podcast, Kwangu.
So, James, as an economist, how do you view the withdrawal of USAID from Africa?
Well, the withdrawal of the USAID funding is a wake-up call to not only African leaders, but to the entire African community to rethink reliance on donor funding, to rethink on reliance on external expertise, and look inward to see how best they can grow the inward potential in order to be able to manage the challenges that face the continent.
But let's consider some of the criticisms of aid. I mean, some argue that foreign aid has made Africa dependent and that it has stifled economic growth. Do you agree with this view?
Well, I think when it comes to criticism against foreign aid, I think the issue is deeper than just dependency and making Africa focus on external markets. I think the first key point is to look at how aid captures narratives within the African continent. You notice for a country to develop, people have to own the development initiative. People have to take the agency. So when a narrative is captured by an external donor, they are the ones who know the answers. They are the ones who have the solutions. Then it makes it extremely difficult for a country to have a self-drive towards internal transformation. So I would say before we even think about dependency, the key problem about foreign aid is how it creates this narrative, and especially from the West. They are the ones who have the answers for all problems that are in Africa. So that's part of the reason I say that the cancellation of USAID funding has to be a wake-up call, because it means we have to recreate new narratives that can drive agents within the continent, even as we relook the issue of dependency and how to grow markets within the continent.
Just picking up on that point about new narratives, obviously there's still a debate about whether African countries are even ready to fully stand on their own without this foreign aid. Are they prepared to handle this shift?
No, I think that's really not correct, because foreign aid is a recent phenomenon. I mean, Africans have been standing on their own feet for centuries before even America became America, before it could even create the USAID platform. So it's not really accurate to say that we cannot stand on our 2 feet. Probably we could rephrase it and say, maybe Africa may fail to stand on its 2 feet as per the bubble USAID had created within the continent, meaning looking to the West for solutions. But now in a multipolar world, it's becoming increasingly clear that Africa can manage to be on its 2 feet. Of course, it's going to be painful given that there was that aspect of dependency, but for sure, Africa has what it takes to stand on its 2 feet and be able to turn around the challenge left behind by the cessation of the funding by United States of America.
Some will argue with you saying that is not correct because for decades we've been getting this foreign aid. So in the first place, if we could do it, why did we receive this foreign aid? Why was there that need to get this foreign aid from countries like the US?
I mean, we have to look at it in terms of foreign aid as a geopolitical tool. So this was a tool by powerful countries exerting their presence within the continent, and it worked for them for the decades that it has. But now we can see multipolarity is what is making the US actually stop giving this fund. It's not that they are looking at the efficiency. I think the question they're asking themselves is why are other emerging economies becoming more influential in Africa without spending as much as the Americans are spending? So the issue really here is not that we cannot stand on our 2 feet. It's about now geopolitical competition within the African space. And the wake-up call here is for us as Africans to have what I'll call situational awareness, that there are competing forces within the continent utilizing all different types of tools, aid being one of them, to exert influence, to be able to access resources that they are looking for. And situational awareness then has to give us the agency to manage our economic situation.
So what is your message to African leaders, and not just the political leaders? For instance, just yesterday, we were hearing from the head of the UNAIDS agency, Winnie Byanyima, talking about the impact this withdrawal is going to have on HIV and AIDS throughout the continent. She's saying that there'll be 2,000 infections per day once this aid stops. So what is your message to leaders like her who are still calling out for help from countries such as the US?
I mean, first of all, it's important that she has that situational awareness of the impact of the cessation. I think maybe what the leaders in Africa needs to have is a conversation on what needs to be done to address that issue. I mean, in Kenya, we've had a debate where, for example, a ministry talked about the impact of the cessation, but at the same time, they were releasing data of how much corruption leakages are going on in the government treasury. And the amounts are almost equal to what they normally receive from donors. So I think as she points out that painful challenge, I think the point would be for African leaders to tighten up their treasuries to make sure they minimize the leakages that happen within the public sector and redirect funds to where it's needed most. That would be the first step. But the second step, of course, which is long term, is to painfully grow our markets within the continent, make sure we make use of our resources instead of always looking to the external. Because part of the issue that has been creating a challenge for Africa, for example, is to always look to feed external markets, either with raw materials or cash crops, which makes it very difficult to focus on growing internal markets, which should generate the much needed income to address some of the challenges such as the one you've just mentioned.
Now, considering that Africa is a continent of many nations, if it's 54, some say 55 nations, some of these African governments have actually said they are going to focus on internal solutions after these aid cuts. But some fear that for some of these countries, it's just political rhetoric. Some of them don't even have the resources or the capability to make real change. What is your comment on this?
Well, it's an opportunity, because we have to really survive. So already the money has been stopped. So it can't be rhetoric. I mean, it would have been rhetoric if the money is still being pumped into the system and a politician saying, yeah, we can still make do without it. So I think what this cessation has done, and we can see even Europe is tilting towards that similar direction, I think African leaders are going to start looking more inward And I think the cessation of these kinds of funds creates a threat that can unify, as you pointed out, the 54 nation states to see that they have got an urgent issue to address. And at this, they could catalyze through the momentum of what was already initiated in terms of trying to create a market within the continent, and also through the upcoming new formations such as the BRICS formation, the South-South, as they call it, to look for alternative ways to, at least in the short run, take care of this huge gap that has been created.
Now, in your opinion, what do you see as the biggest obstacles African governments will face in trying to fix these problems on their own? Or do you think it will be smooth sailing?
Well, I think the biggest obstacle is, well, I would say, the ruthlessness of big power competition. I mean, we've just seen what's happening, for example, in Ukraine, where negotiations for access to what you call critical mineral resources, and how it shows that big powers can go to an extreme length to get what they need. And we know Africa is a home to over 30% of these types of critical mineral resources. So I think that's going to be a big challenge, where Africa has to craft a way of how to navigate the interest of the big powers to access these mineral resources, and how to make sure they get compensated appropriately. Because if such compensation for mineral resources does happen, then a lot of what we are discussing about aid will not be a big topic to discuss. Obviously, of course, nature abhors vacuum. And if the US stops, China will step in, but I doubt they'll step in using a similar model to USAID, because the Chinese will not start preaching about values, democracy, and human rights. I think they already demonstrated they're keen on focusing on infrastructure projects, which Africa very much needs to be able to actualize its continental free trade area. So, and then lastly, just as in terms of pragmatism, we can't really say US has stopped, because I'm sure US will come back in one form or the other. So that's why we are cautiously using this word wake up call. Wake up call means wake up. A game is changing. Rules are changing. And the competition space is also changing. And therefore, things cannot work the way they have been working for the last 7 decades or so.
And in terms of a Pan-African nationalist movement, do you see this coming back, or a much stronger Pan-African nationalist movement, because of this withdrawal of foreign aid? I mean, you did mention earlier on that it's not just the US. There's so much talk about minimizing this foreign aid, even in Europe. Do you see a point where African countries will unite and stand up for themselves? All 54 countries? And then what role will organizations such as SADC, the regional organizations, or the big mother body, Africa Union, play in this Pan-Africanist movement?
Yeah, I think what's going to lead to a revamped Pan-Africanist movement is this renewed interest in what the West is referring to as critical mineral resources. Because you notice there's interest, a lot of memorandums are being signed between Western countries and African countries to access these mineral resources, but the poverty levels are not being addressed. The income levels for these countries are not being addressed. We've seen the Sahel countries kicking out the French, for example, saying, look, you've been mining all this stuff from us and we have not seen any transformation. So I think this renewed rush to access African natural resources, not only minerals, we know even in the agricultural sector, there's also the rush to access vast lands for food production. And then there's also the rush to access African youth, by the way, as labor, because some of the Western countries are now having what you call older demographics. I think that's going to reignite some new energy into the Pan-Africanist movement that might not sound so similar to the one that was there during the independence time. And of course, lastly, is the use of digital technology, because I think if you compare the older version of Pan-Africanist movement, it would be a slow process, reading books, reading newspapers. But nowadays, with what happened in Burkina Faso, for example, it will be known within a second across the continent. So, and creating a lot of enthusiasm among young people to also try to drive a sense of purpose in a competitive world.
Okay, and you've talked about the Sahel countries kicking out France, embracing Russia. I mean, there's also a lot of discussion about the role of China and the Gulf countries in filling in the gap left by Western aid. Some say this could be a new form of neocolonialism. What's your take on this?
But I think as far as what I refer to as the global market architecture is concerned and financial architecture, anything that still relegates Africa to the periphery will not be a welcome idea. And I think what I've seen, especially when you read the BRICS papers, I think they try to steer clear of the model of colonialism to a model of collaboration. The model of colonialism was one side knows it all. It had a linear approach. The receiving side must just follow the orders. But then when you look at what the BRICS and the South-South team is trying to craft together is where they say, let us collaborate to transform, to change the system as it were, so as to make sure everybody enjoys the benefits. But again, this is still in the early stages because we can't project to the future at the moment now that it's not yet clear in terms of who will emerge the bigger leader in the South-South. For now, of course, it's still a conversation that is ongoing.
So it's not crystal clear that this new kind of partnership would truly benefit Africa. Would you agree with that?
It will give Africa breathing space because with the strange stranglehold that Africa has had where it can't utilize its own resources, it's made to believe into the narrative that it's poor when it's rich. That's a kind of breathing space that this gap is creating, that suddenly Africans are waking up to the realization, look, everybody is interested in our resources. Everybody is interested in us being the next production hub. Everybody is interested in us becoming the next market. So you see, that's a good realization. If we think through it strategically, it can create the very much needed transformation on the continent. But of course, if we don't, then we'll fall in a similar trap of the past where we might erroneously believe that there's an outsider who is coming to save Africa. That has been the old model, that there's a savior coming into Africa to transform. It can't work like that. Africans have to be the ones to drive their own transformation.
Now, James, looking ahead, what do you think is the most important change African countries need to make in order to succeed without relying on this foreign aid? I mean, how can they ensure this change benefits the people on the ground?
I think first we have to recognize that we've got youthful demographics. And so we need to relook the type of education we give them. So quality education is key to ensure that our youthful demographics become fruitful to the continent. Second is to focus on building African internal markets, because a lot of focus has been on exporting outside. And focusing on building internal markets starts with regional economic blocks, going all the way, of course, to the continental free trade area. Third is to look at the narrative, because so far the narrative sweeping the continent is that without aid, you're dead. That's not correct. We need to rework the narrative to give agency to African people that you've got what it takes to create the very much needed transformation. And then, of course, the last is not to forget that we cannot live in an island. We need the rest of the world. So we need to reimagine how we cooperate with other countries, including United States of America, Europe, China, craft some smart ways of cooperation with these countries without necessarily pegging it to aid, because pegging it to aid has really made it very difficult even for African leaders to have a futuristic view on how they manage their affairs in their own countries.
So with 54 nations with diverse backgrounds, diverse leaderships, will it be every nation for itself, or do you think the African Union can actually unite the continent? To follow through with your thoughts.
First of all, the threat that is facing these 54 nation states is a common threat. You have a youthful demographic, they need jobs, they need livelihoods. So if you don't cooperate, then you're going to be in trouble. So that threat should unite the 54 nation states. Second, the 54 nation states that have been relying on foreign aid, suddenly they can see cuts coming. So if they do not unite to grow markets internally, then of course the scenario of everyone for himself and good for us all will surely become a reality. And then of course, looking at lessons from what we call emerging economies, it gives Africa an opportunity to have templates to learn from. Unlike, let's say, in the 50s, when they had only one-sided source of inspiration, now they've got quite a number of inspiring options they can have a look at and domesticate within the continent. And of course, to the Africa Union question, it's still a big challenge, of course. We know it's our unifying body, but the challenge is that it's yet to also generate income from within, because Africa Union also is facing a similar challenge to the nation state where it relies on donors in driving its agenda. So that's why the umbrella word here is wake-up call. The wake-up call is for everybody, individual African, nation states, regional bodies, all the way to the Africa Union, that as long as you surrender your initiative to external donors, then you're not going to drive an African agenda, as it were.
James, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Kwangu, for having me in your podcast.
You've been listening to Global Insights on the Lead. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Kwangu Liwewe. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, where you'll find Global Insights the last Friday of every month. See you next time.